Wow. Good afternoon. Really? Especially after all that energy that Pam brought up here. Good afternoon. That's a little better. It is great to be here. Thank you, Pam. Thank you, Kate. Thank you to the folks, everyone with Local Government Commission. I don't know if you heard what Kate said, but I hope you did. That at the national level, folks aren't being as supportive of this conference as they used to be. In the last year, I feel like everything I care about has been rained on, and this sort of just is one more thing on top of the pile. But I wanted to say, in listening to Kate and Pam, just what a reminder of how important this gathering is. I think my first Smart Growth Conference was 8 years ago in Seattle. And it has been and continues to be one of the few places that really leads in talking about the critical need for us to think about change in a multidisciplinary and a multi-sector way. And we are not getting to the communities we want to live in without that approach. And I think everybody in this room knows that. I wanted to start out by just sort of naming again the moment we're in. Raise your hand if in the last year you have felt a little bit of anger or a little bit of cynicism. Sometimes it's good to know you're in good company, you know what I mean? It can be supportive. One of the things that I'm really clear about, and I should name this even though he stepped from the room, it is always an honor to be on stage with Manuel Pastor. And one of the things that he's always helpful for me on is wrestling with my own sense of anger and cynicism. But I've been spending a lot of time thinking about this, and cynicism is really at its core just the absence of power. You know what I mean? Like, you never heard somebody who's like, I've got a whole bunch of power, I've got all the resources I need, and I'm feeling really cynical, right? And so in that way, one of the profound questions in front of us is, how do we get more power? Just being real. And it's one of the things, again, that I so much appreciate about this conference, is that it's real about what it takes to get to change. And anger and fear are really, at their core, just sort of the absence of love. And so, as we go through the conference together over the next few days, here's to all of you finding the power you need to create the change you need in your communities, and holding on to the love you need to sustain it. I'm getting the great pleasure of talking to you today about structural racism. Raise your hand if you could give me a definition of structural racism. So I'm going to spend some time talking about that. And everybody went so quiet. That was one of those moments where people like ducked their head, like I was going to hand out a test, right? But it's critical. We're in a moment, right? It doesn't matter if we're talking about rising income inequality, if we're talking about increased hate violence, if we're talking about immigration, if we're talking about healthcare, you pick it, it is in this moment not only deeply politically polarized, it is deeply racialized. And we are not getting to the outcomes we want to see unless we figure out how to have that conversation in a fundamentally different way. There's no escaping it. We are in a political moment, and it is a moment, that happens every 70 or 80 years, like clockwork in our country. Jump back 70 years ago, it's the civil rights movement, right? And we're talking again about what does it mean for us to be a democracy, and what does it mean for us to wrestle with the idea of race. You can jump back 70 years before that, it's the end of Reconstruction. We are having the same conversation because at its core, the ideas of race and equality and democracy are inextricably linked for us as a country. They were the founding questions of our country, and in many ways they were the founding sin of our country. So us not figuring out how to have that conversation means that we keep getting to have this conversation in some of the most destructive ways possible. The good news in that is that the founding of our country started with two ideas. One was a founding dream, right, about equality, and the other was a founding reality that didn't look much like that dream. But the truth is that we are so young as a country. It's easy to imagine that as history, but make no mistake about it, this is a founding moment. That's what we're doing right now. We're founding this country. And so the opportunity for us is that we can finally get it right. This is the moment to get it right. So I want to talk a little bit about defining some terms, and then I want to give you all a few examples where I really, around the country, where people are really leading the way in this conversation and really connecting it to our ideas of growth and prosperity. And then I'm going to turn it over to Manuel to actually fill in all the blanks. It was mentioned, I'm president of an organization now called Race Forward. We recently went through a merger process, two organizations, Center for Social Inclusion and Race Forward. We are now one, with one simple idea that we are stronger together. And again, in this moment, that seems like such a critical idea. This is from a survey that I really appreciated. The first question was, are you comfortable in talking about race? And like nearly 90% of people said, yeah, I'm comfortable in talking about race. And the second question was, is your neighbor comfortable in talking about race? And you can kind of guess, nearly about 90% of people said, no, absolutely not, right? I'm good, you're not, is our national conversation on race, right? So the question in front of us is, how do we start to break some of that down? Because it has very real implications for our lives. So in the United States, it doesn't matter what sort of key social indicator in life you're looking at, you pick it. Education, health, right? Just pick it. And race is the leading or one of the leading reasons for, or outcomes for, based on success, right? The Ferguson report, folks familiar? Powerful report. If you haven't had a chance to read it, you should. It's not only powerful in talking about the realities of policing in the United States, but also about local government and the ways in which local government actually uses policing as a form of taxation, right? But the figure in the Ferguson report that's always stuck with me is that in Ferguson, based on zip code, and as Kate shared, zip code is just a euphemism for race in the United States, right? The life expectancy difference is 30 years, 30, a full lifetime. And that is not just about policing, that is about the collective failure in all of those areas of health, right? Of education, of the criminal justice system. So the question is, you know, for us, is we are now 50 plus years outside of the civil rights movement. How is that possible in 2018? Right? How is it possible in 2018 that I can tell you based on the color of your skin, the likelihood of your success? I have not found a quicker way to do this, so you're gonna have to do it with me. Some of you I know have. Pick a number between 1 and 10 and don't tell anybody. Got your number? Multiply that number times 9. And take your time on this part. For many people in this room, multiplication was many years ago. So make sure you take your time. Got your number? If it's a 2-digit number, I want you to add them together. So if it was 32, for example, it would be 3 plus 2 equals 5. You want to come back to a single digit. If you have a single digit, don't worry about it. Good? Subtract 5 from that number. You good? Okay. Now you're going to convert that number into a letter. So A is 1, B is 2. You following me? Got your letter? Okay. Thinking of your letter, think of a country that starts with that letter. This is my entire presentation, so you might as well enjoy it. Last one. So you got your, actually it's not your last one. You got your country. Last letter in your country. Got it? Think of an animal that starts with that letter. Good? Last letter in your animal's name. Think of a fruit that starts with that letter. You good? So tell me if you are thinking about kangaroos in Denmark eating oranges. Raise your hand if you got Denmark kangaroo orange. How'd that work? Really quickly. How'd that work? Any guesses? Besides Jedi mind tricks, any guesses? Eurocentrism. No question. Hold this with me, that the math was a distraction, right? If you did your math right, you should have ended up with the number 4. If you didn't, don't feel bad about it. I didn't get it right the first time either. But if you got your math right, you should have ended up with the number 4, which means you should have started with the letter D. So the real question in all of those questions, out of all of them, was just one. It was, what country starts with the letter D? That was it. Djibouti. Nice. One of my favorites. Anything else besides Djibouti? Dominican Republic, right on. The Democratic Republic of Congo. There's also the Democratic Republic of Korea. What are we leaving out? And Dominica. Not country. Denmark. Lots of Denmarks. So there's really only 4 formally recognized countries that start with the letter D by the UN. So both the democratic ones are not formally recognized. So there's 6 in total if you include them. So we know there's a little bit of bias happening. And hold this with me, to this set of questions, 70 to 90% of people in the United States will say Denmark kangaroo orange. It's like clockwork. You can use it at any party, I promise you. The power of it is, like, if we were all sitting in the Caribbean right now and I said, think of a country that starts with the letter D, probably more of us would say Dominican Republic or Dominica, right? If we were sitting in Central Northern Africa, probably many more of us would say Djibouti. So we know we have that bias, but hold this with me. How many animals start with the letter K? Anybody get something besides kangaroo? Koala, right? It turns out there's literally dozens of animals that start with the letter K. With me? Like kitten, kingfish, keep going. And it turns out there's actually 6 fruit that start with the letter O. Like olive is a fruit. I didn't know that, but it is. So hold this. Math is a distraction, like so much of our daily lives. Just put there to make us not hear the real question, right? And then there's this whole series of questions in which 70 to 90% of us come up with the same answer to a set of questions in which there's over 1 million possible answers. Over 1 million. Because it turns out that even when we think we're starting with our own ideas, there's a whole set of history and culture, structure, institutional policy and practice that drives all of us endlessly to the same outcome. When we say structural and structural racism, that is what structural is. And it's cute when we're talking about animals and countries with fruit. And it's devastating when it comes to issues like race or gender. Folks with me? Promise you tomorrow somebody will wake up and say, I've got a brand new idea for taking on racial equity. It is Denmark kangaroo orange. So the real question for us is just a simple one. It's, how do we get to 1 million possibilities? Right? So I want to spend just a second and talk about our work at Race Forward, both just to share what we do, but it's also how we think about how you get to those 1 million possibilities. So we do two core functions, which is movement and capacity building, really supporting people and thinking about structural interventions. And we do research to actually lift up examples of success. But the core interventions are changing our narrative. Got to find a different way of talking about race. And we've got to lift up voices that are typically not heard. We have to get real about policy change. And policy is just new ideas. Everybody in this room works on them in some way, but that are clear about centering equity. And we fundamentally have to transform our institutions, right? When you say Denmark, you don't just say Denmark because your parents said Denmark or a random person said Denmark. You say Denmark because if you open up the newspaper to travel section, you are much more likely to see Denmark than Djibouti. It is because if you open up a children's book to the letter D, you are much more likely to read Denmark than Dominican Republic. Our institutions reinforce what is the norm. And if we want to get to different outcomes, we've got to help our institutions understand that that norm is no longer the norm. Folks with me? So those three core structural interventions we see as critical to change. One of the things that we really lean into in our work is working with government, thinking about how do you apply that, how do you operationalize those ideas in practice. And so we have a national network called the Government Alliance on Race and Equity. We are now formally as a network, we have 70 members and are growing. Really proud to say that the city of New York came on at the end of the year, which was fantastic, but even better, I found out yesterday, Pipestone, Minnesota, my hometown, is coming on. And if you've never been to Pipestone, you should go. But we really, at our core, we're now working in 30 states, and it's really working with government to recognize what I was naming earlier, that we are not getting to equity without changing government, without having a functioning government, and we are not getting to a functional government or democracy without racial equity. They're inextricably tied together. So I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about both those structural interventions and some of the ways in which government plays a role. Raise your hand if you're familiar with Spark. Raise your hand if you're part of one of the Spark sites. Looks like maybe a couple of folks. Strong, Prosperous, and Resilient Communities Challenge. I named this, we had the opportunity to work to help shape the thinking around what this particular initiative would be. It's place-based. It's a $90 million investment in 6 cities, Atlanta, Denver, Chicago, Los Angeles, Memphis, and San Francisco Bay Area. That's really both thinking about multidisciplinary approaches and multi-sector approaches, but it does something that is, for me, oh so refreshing, which it centers around racial equity, leads with it, health and health equity, and climate justice. And the beauty of it is that it's being supported by some of the most important institutions in our country. It's being led by Enterprise, the Fed here in San Francisco, LIF, and NRDC, and it's being supported by Ford Foundation, JPB, Kresge, Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, and the California Endowment here. I named this because this is new. And one of the things that I want to talk to you all about is not just what's occurring in individual jurisdictions or sites in terms of success, but the critical way in which we need to think how we approach this work, right? Coming back to that idea of what are structural interventions. And if we are not leading with equity, if we are not thinking about taking a multi-sector approach, we are really going to struggle to get to see the kind of long-term, deep changes that we're all hoping to see in our communities. So I'm going to drill down. I should say before leaving Spark, I know there will be some folks here who will be talking about some of the work in those cities, and I encourage you to if you get a chance, to take it in. I also encourage you to check out the website where there's actually breakdowns on which each of those communities is doing and what it looks like. But one of the things that was beautiful about it is that it wasn't focused on any one project. It was literally, we want to center community, talk about equity, center health, talk about transportation and growth, and you tell us what that project is and how you're going to implement it in 3 years. We need more of that kind of support for this work. I want to spend just a second and do a deeper dive into talking about Salinas. Anyone here from Salinas, Monterey County? Hey. So the work in Salinas for me is, again, I'm going to just talk about the approach, but critical in terms of thinking about how we get to different outcomes. Salinas is one of the BHC sites, Building Healthy Community sites, that's supported by the California Endowment. It really focuses on policies and systems change towards health and racial equity. I'm just going to throw this up so you can see it quickly. We had the great privilege to work with the community in Salinas in partnership with the city of Salinas, local government. And it really was a combination of really looking at racial equity through systems and a racial healing approach. And just wanted to share, it was in that way, well, two things to name. One is, it is the first place that I've had the pleasure of working in where community is actually pushing a real inside-outside strategy. What I mean by that is that community is actually pushing not only the fact that we need to hold government accountable for its policy and practice, but is really deeply committed to the success of local government and thinking differently about these issues and helping government actually go through its own internal transformation about what it means to center equity and what it means to do that, again, in a with a multi-sector approach. I'm going to share this and then I'm going to turn it over to Manuel. But the lessons we learned coming out of that that I think are invaluable as folks are thinking about your work wherever it may be is the absolute necessity of supporting community organizing, and that we actually have some thought about collective healing. That this work is fundamentally both head work and heart work. And if we want to get real about the history and the present realities of race in our communities, we've got to have some tough conversations. Darren Walker from Ford Foundation says, we've got to be okay with getting uncomfortable. Just that simple, right? And so how do we create that space? But within that space, never lose sight that this is about supporting community and building power, right? Folks actually can have, in a meaningful way, ownership over the institutions that are in their lives. Balancing racial healing and systemic equity. It is great for us to have conversations about both our history and the current realities of race and what that means in our lives and how we see it playing out, and that is not enough. Necessary, but insufficient. We've got to get real about systemic change. We've got to get real about policy and practice. We've got to get real about how do we actually operationalize these ideas in the work we see. Engaging government staff at every level. I cannot tell you how frequently both government, interestingly, because it is them, and community miss this point. Elected officials, love you all. But to be clear, the power of government exists in its employees. Make no mistake about it. I mean, in the last year, a lot of conversation about the deep state, right? The truth is that government employees represent the overwhelming breadth of the budget for local government, and they're the ones who are implementing the overwhelming majority of the budget. And so getting real about where it is that we need to have relationship is critical if we were actually really thinking about how we want to make change. The last thing I want to name is build the we with shared language and experience. It's kind of what we're spending just a few minutes doing today. We've got to be using shared language. If I say I'm talking about racism and the first thing you imagine is you're talking about whether or not I'm a good person, but I'm talking about structural racism, we're not even having the same conversation. You with me? So we've got to get really good about defining what it is that we're talking about. We also need to be better about understanding each other's experience and creating space to hold it. In closing, this is a piece that we name all the time, and I just think it's critical that when we focus on solutions for those who are most vulnerable in our communities, we always come up with solutions that work better for everyone. That is our definition of equity. We are fundamentally thinking about how we can impact those in our community who most need it, with the operating assumption that that will make better outcomes for all of us. I so much appreciate your time today, and look forward to engaging with you all over the next couple of days at the conference. Thank you.